some marriages begin with desire. This one began with ownership. Beneath the gold ceilings of imperial Rome, love became another instrument of conquest, and a human being became proof that power could consume even the idea of identity itself. The smell of burned cedar and hot oil clung to the palace walls long after midnight, drifting through corridors lined with black marble, where servants walked with lowered eyes and senators whispered behind jeweled sleeves. Because somewhere deep inside the imperial residence, a slave was being washed in milk and perfume before being presented to the most powerful man in the world like a sacred object prepared for sacrifice. And outside the chamber, the empire continued breathing, as if nothing unnatural was happening at all, as if Rome had not slowly transformed domination into intimacy and cruelty into ceremony. Because that was the genius of imperial power. It could make horror look civilized under torchlight. The emperor's guards stood motionless beside bronze doors, while musicians played softly in distant halls to drown the sounds of weeping. And behind those doors, the young slave, once a human being with a name, a family, a childhood buried somewhere beneath dust and war and the machinery of conquest, was being remade into something Rome could understand only through possession. Silk-touched skin that still carried scars from punishment. Gold chains rested against a throat once bruised by iron collars. Perfumed oils concealed the smell of fear. And somewhere nearby the emperor watched in silence, studying the transformation with the detached fascination of a man who had long ago stopped seeing other people as fully real. Rome had created many monsters before him, but the truly terrifying thing was that he had not emerged from chaos. He had emerged from civilization itself. The empire had shaped him carefully, fed him power slowly, rewarded every cruelty that maintained order. By the time he reached the throne, there was almost nothing left inside him, except appetite wrapped in ritual. The slave had belonged to another household once, before politics and punishment carried him into imperial possession, like debris pulled into a whirlpool. Some said he had first been noticed during games held after an execution, standing among attendants carrying wine beneath enormous awnings, stained red by sunset and blood. Others claimed the emperor saw him after the destruction of a noble family accused of conspiracy, when estates were seized and servants redistributed like furniture among loyal officials. In Rome, defeat did not end with death. It spread outward into children, wives, slaves, names, memories. Entire bloodlines dissolved quietly into the imperial system until all that remained was ownership paperwork sealed in wax. That was how empires erased people most effectively. Not always with swords, but with administration. And the emperor understood this perfectly. He understood that destroying a person physically was temporary. Transforming them into something useful was eternal. The slave was young, striking, almost painfully beautiful beneath the torchlight, with features delicate enough that Roman poets later described him less like a man and more like a carved statue animated by grief. But beauty inside imperial Rome was dangerous currency. Beauty attracted attention. Attention invited possession. And possession near the emperor often became annihilation disguised as favor. The palace itself seemed built to enforce this psychological suffocation. Endless corridors, echoing chambers, walls polished so perfectly they reflected distorted fragments of faces as people passed. Even sound behaved strangely there. Footsteps stretched unnaturally long across stone. Whispers lingered in corners, water dripping from fountains sounded like distant chains. Every servant inside the palace learned quickly that survival depended on becoming emotionally invisible. The emperor liked obedience, but more than obedience, he liked surrender. He wanted people hollowed out by dependence. He wanted their identity softened until it could be rewritten around him. And this slave trapped inside the gravitational pull of imperial attention, was slowly being rewritten day by day. First came the clothing, silk dyed in colors forbidden to ordinary Romans, jewelry normally reserved for noble women, perfumes imported from Egypt and Arabia. Then came the isolation. Old companions disappeared. Familiar servants were replaced. Language itself began changing around him. The emperor renamed him publicly, as powerful men often did when claiming ownership over conquered things. A new name meant the old self could begin dying properly. Rome understood symbolism better than almost any civilization in history. That was why its violence felt so psychologically complete. Nothing happened accidentally. Every ritual carried a message. Every ceremony reinforced hierarchy. Even humiliation was choreographed with artistic precision. Soon rumors spread through the capital like smoke through crowded alleys. Senators laughed quietly during private dinners. Soldiers exchanged crude stories in barracks. Market crowds whispered beneath temple steps. The emperor was obsessed. The emperor was changing the slave. The emperor intended something impossible. But in Rome, impossible things often became reality, simply because no one possessed the power to stop them. Fear moved through the city constantly, hidden beneath the appearance of order. People learned to react to imperial madness the way sailors reacted to storms. Not with outrage, but with adaptation. One wrong expression during a banquet could destroy an entire family. One overheard joke could lead to confiscated estates, public executions, disappearances in the night. So the empire adjusted itself around the emperor's desires with terrifying smoothness. Tailors altered garments, priests rewrote rituals, courtiers practiced new forms of flattery. Language bent carefully around power until even absurdity sounded sacred. The slave, meanwhile, disappeared deeper into the palace, becoming less a person than a reflection of imperial appetite. Witnesses later described elaborate feasts where the emperor displayed him openly among senators and military commanders, while musicians played and incense clouded the ceilings in silver waves. Some guests looked away. Others stared too long. No one intervened. Because intervention required believing morality mattered more than survival, and imperial Rome had spent generations teaching its elites the opposite lesson. Power was the highest reality. Everything else, love, dignity, law, religion, could be reshaped around it. That was the true architecture of empire. Marble was merely decoration. The real foundation was fear. Yet what made the situation more disturbing was the emperor's apparent affection. He did not simply use the slave privately. He elevated him, paraded him, spoke to him with strange tenderness before crowds accustomed to executions and military triumphs. It unsettled people because genuine emotion inside systems built on domination always becomes warped. The emperor seemed to crave intimacy while simultaneously destroying the conditions necessary for real human connection to exist. He wanted devotion from someone he owned completely. He wanted love from a person whose survival depended on pleasing him. And somewhere inside this contradiction lived the darkest truth about absolute power. Eventually, it becomes incapable of distinguishing affection from obedience. The slave learned this lesson slowly, painfully, beneath chandeliers dripping gold light onto polished floors slick with spilled wine and crushed flower petals. There were moments, witnesses claimed, when he appeared almost regal beside the emperor during ceremonies, dressed in silk so expensive entire villages could have survived for years on its cost. But beneath the spectacle remained the invisible structure controlling everything. He could not leave, he could not refuse. His elevation existed entirely at the emperor's pleasure. One shift in mood could return him instantly to chains, punishment, disappearance. Rome specialized in conditional luxury. The empire often rewarded submission magnificently, precisely because it reminded everyone that all rewards flowed downward from power. During festivals, the emperor sometimes dressed the slave in garments associated with empresses, provoking fascination and disgust throughout elite society. Some historians later described these scenes with mocking and disbelief, but the reality underneath was less theatrical and far more psychologically disturbing. This was not rebellion against Roman norms. It was their logical extreme. Rome had always fused domination with performance. Triumph parades displayed conquered kings in chains before execution. Gladiatorial games turned death into entertainment. Public ceremonies transformed political hierarchy into religious spectacle. The emperor was merely applying the same imperial logic to intimacy itself. If he possessed someone absolutely, why not remake them entirely? Why not erase every boundary between ownership and identity? The palace adapted again. Courtiers bowed. Servants rehearsed new protocols. Priests muttered reluctant blessings beneath painted ceilings, while torch smoke climbed toward the darkness overhead. The slave became trapped inside a living theater production, written by imperial obsession. Yet beneath the luxury and ritual lurked constant terror. Ancient sources describe volatile moods, sudden punishments, eruptions of paranoia spreading through the palace like fire through dry cloth. People vanished overnight. Advisors lost favor without warning. Executions followed whispers. The empire during this period resembled a magnificent building whose foundations were quiet cracking beneath everyone's feet. And at the center stood the emperor and the slave he had transformed into both companion and symbol. Rome watched obsessively because the relationship exposed something people normally tried not to see too clearly. Under absolute power, human beings become material. Gender, status, morality, even identity itself could be reorganized according to imperial desire. The system did not protect individuals from the ruler. The system existed to magnify the ruler's will until it became reality. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, ordinary Romans continued daily life beneath this machinery. Bakers opened shops before dawn. Laborers hauled stone through crowded streets smelling of sweat and sewage. Mothers carried water beneath statues of forgotten generals. Soldiers drank in taverns illuminated by smoky lamps. Civilization continued functioning beautifully on the surface, while hidden violence pulsed underneath like blood beneath skin. That was always Rome's greatest illusion. The empire appeared eternal because it concealed its human cost behind ritual and architecture. But every polished marble column rested ultimately on conquered bodies. Every imperial banquet existed because countless invisible people had been broken to sustain it. And inside the palace, the slave understood this intimately. He had become one of those hidden costs, transformed into decoration. Sometimes the emperor reportedly spoke of marriage openly, almost casually, during drunken feasts, while guests froze in careful silence around him. Then came the ceremony itself. Not metaphor, not rumor. A real imperial ceremony, performed beneath sacred firelight while musicians played and officials observed, with controlled expressions that concealed terror behind etiquette. Rome's ruler married the slave he had reshaped through ownership. The psychological violence of the moment rippled far beyond scandal. Marriage in Rome carried enormous symbolic meaning connected to lineage, citizenship, inheritance, stability. By staging such a union publicly, the emperor demonstrated something deeper than eccentricity. He demonstrated that under absolute authority, even the foundational structures of society could become extensions of personal appetite. The ceremony glowed with suffocating opulence. Gold lamps flickered against walls painted with scenes of gods devouring mortals. Incense thickened the air until breathing felt heavy. Silk rustled softly across mosaic floors. And there, beneath the weight of empire itself, stood the slave transformed into spouse, by the same system that had first destroyed his freedom. Witnesses described confusion in the crowd, but confusion was only the visible surface emotion. Underneath lived something darker: recognition. People were seeing power stripped of its comforting disguises. They were watching the empire reveal what it had always been capable of becoming. Some laughed afterward, because laughter is often how frightened societies process humiliation. Satirists mocked the ceremony carefully in coded language. Senators exchanged poisoned jokes behind closed doors. But none of them challenged the emperor directly, because everyone understood the real danger. The issue was never merely the marriage. The issue was that Rome had created a political structure where one man's desires could overwrite reality itself. Once that became normal, no boundary remained secure. The slave, now publicly elevated yet privately imprisoned more completely than ever, moved through palace life like a ghost wrapped in silk. Accounts suggest moments of visible melancholy during celebrations, flashes of emptiness beneath ceremonial perfection. It is difficult to know how much of this is true. History often projects tragedy onto beautiful victims because audiences crave emotional clarity. But psychological reality rarely needs embellishment inside systems of domination. Imagine the isolation. Imagine being surrounded constantly by luxury that functions simultaneously as a cage. Imagine knowing every smile directed toward you is filtered through fear of the man beside you. Imagine losing the ability to distinguish tenderness from coercion because survival depends on emotional adaptation. This is what empires do to human beings. They distort internal reality until domination begins masquerading as intimacy, even inside the victim's own mind. Somewhere around the middle of this descent, as Rome drowned itself in spectacle and whispers spread through every corridor of power, there were still people quietly preserving forbidden truths in hidden corners of the empire, recording what official histories tried to smooth away. Witnesses carrying fragments of human suffering through generations like smoldering embers beneath ash, and channels like Ancestral exist for that same reason now. To enter the buried chambers beneath civilization, to uncover the story's polished marble, was built to conceal, to continue tracing the fingerprints of power across the throats of the forgotten. The emperor, meanwhile, spiraled further into instability. Political tension tightened across the empire like a rope slowly being pulled. Armies grew restless. Officials maneuvered carefully for survival. Economic strain spread beneath the spectacle of imperial excess. Yet inside the palace, ritual continued: feasts, ceremonies, games, endless performances designed to maintain the illusion that Rome remained invincible. This is another truth civilizations rarely admit openly. The more unstable power becomes, the more obsessively it performs grandeur. Decadence often blooms brightest near collapse. The emperor's relationship with the slave became increasingly symbolic of this unraveling world. Some saw affection, others saw madness. But underneath both interpretations lived the same core reality. One human being had been consumed by the machinery surrounding another. Ownership had become intimacy, because empire no longer recognized meaningful distinctions between them. The palace itself felt increasingly haunted during these final years. Torches hissed in damp hallways. Rainwater gathered in courtyard stones beneath statues streaked black by smoke. Guards whispered about omens and conspiracies. Servants moved nervously through kitchens heavy with the smell of roasting meat and spilled wine. Rome was still powerful enough to terrify the world, but internally, it had begun feeding upon itself psychologically. Fear moved downward through every social layer. The emperor feared betrayal. Courtiers feared execution. Citizens feared accusation. Slaves feared everyone. Entire societies can function for astonishing lengths of time while spiritually collapsing from within. That is perhaps the most disturbing lesson ancient Rome offers modern audiences. Civilization and brutality are not opposites. Often they evolve together. The slave at the center of this story remained trapped inside that contradiction until the very end. Some accounts describe him participating dutifully in imperial rituals, his expression unreadable beneath jewels and ceremonial cosmetics. Others claim he became emotionally withdrawn, almost spectral, wandering through palace gardens at night beside fountains reflecting torchlight like liquid gold. What would survival even mean in such circumstances? Freedom had been erased so completely that identity itself became unstable. The emperor had not simply owned him physically. He had rewritten the social meaning of his existence. And because Rome validated that transformation publicly, resistance became almost psychologically impossible. That is how systems of power achieve permanence. They invade not only bodies but imagination. Eventually, people stop remembering alternative realities ever existed. Then came the inevitable collapse. Emperors who rule through fear rarely die peacefully because fear creates enemies faster than loyalty. Political conspiracies thickened around the palace. Military leaders calculated risks behind closed doors. Senators positioned themselves carefully for whatever storm approached next. Rome had always treated emperors as semi-divine publicly, while privately understanding they were mortal men balanced precariously atop oceans of resentment. Once weakness appeared, survival instincts activated it everywhere simultaneously. The emperor sensed it too. Ancient descriptions from this period feel feverish. Paranoia, frantic movement through the palace, desperate attempts to maintain authority through spectacle and punishment. Torches burned late into the night while messages traveled secretly through corridors. Outside, the city waited tensely beneath cold stars and smoke-filled skies. And somewhere inside that suffocating atmosphere remained the slave empress, still bound emotionally and politically to the man who had destroyed and elevated him in the same movement. When collapse finally came, it arrived not with dignity but panic. Imperial systems often portray themselves as eternal until the exact moment they disintegrate chaotically under pressure. Guards abandoned posts, allies vanished, loyalty evaporated. The emperor who once bent reality itself through command suddenly found himself isolated by the very fear he had cultivated. Because fear obeys only strength. Once strength falters, fear changes direction instantly. Accounts differ on the final moments, but all agree on the atmosphere. Confusion, desperation, corridors echoing with running footsteps, doors slamming, distant shouting beneath torch smoke and darkness. The empire that had once revolved entirely around one man's desires began reorganizing itself immediately around his absence. That is another brutal truth about systems of power. No matter how absolute someone appears, the machinery always prepares silently to continue without them. And what of the slave he married? History becomes colder here. Sources fragment. Mentions grow brief, almost careless, because once power withdraws its attention, the people consumed by it often disappear from the record entirely. That may be the cruelest ending of all. Not dramatic execution, not public tragedy, erasure. The empire moved on. New rulers emerged, new ceremonies replaced old ones, marble halls were cleaned, statues altered. Official narratives adjusted carefully. The slave who had once stood beside imperial authority beneath gold firelight became another fading shadow, buried beneath administrative continuity. Rome survived because empires are designed to metabolize human lives into memory loss, but fragments remain. Small details preserved accidentally by hostile historians, gossiping elites, frightened witnesses. Enough to reconstruct the emotional outline of what happened. Enough to glimpse the human cost hidden inside political spectacle. A slave was destroyed, reshaped, elevated, displayed, married, and finally discarded by the most powerful civilization on Earth. And millions watched it happen while continuing daily life, because systems this large teach ordinary people to normalize almost anything. That is why stories like this endure. Not because they are strange, but because they are recognizable. Civilization repeatedly creates environments where power invades intimacy, where institutions reshape identity, where human beings become symbolic objects used to stabilize authority. The costumes change across centuries. The machinery remains hauntingly familiar. Even now, modern societies surround domination with ceremony and language designed to soften its appearance. Bureaucracies hide suffering behind paperwork. Governments aestheticize violence through patriotic symbolism. Wealth disguises exploitation beneath luxury and branding. People adapt psychologically because adaptation feels safer than confrontation. Rome simply performed these mechanisms more openly, under brighter torchlight, with more visible marble and blood. In the end, the emperor who married the slave he destroyed did not reveal the corruption of Rome by accident. He revealed its deepest logic perfectly. An empire built upon conquest eventually carries conquest into every human relationship it touches. Ownership becomes emotional, violence becomes ritual, love itself becomes contaminated by hierarchy, and somewhere beneath the ceremonies and incense and silk, real people disappear inside systems too large to recognize their humanity anymore. Long after the palace fires dimmed and the bronze doors closed and the whispers faded into history, the emotional residue remained trapped inside the story like smoke sealed within stone, because this was never only about one emperor or one slave. It was about what happens when civilization rewards domination so completely that cruelty begins wearing the face of affection. It was about the terrifying flexibility of human morality under pressure from power. And it was about the silence surrounding suffering once societies decide survival matters more than truth. Tonight, the ruins of Rome still stand beneath changing skies, their arches broken, their marble stained by centuries of rain and ash, and tourists walk through them, searching for greatness, while rarely sensing the invisible grief layered beneath every stone. But the grief is there, in the corridors where servants once lowered their eyes, in the chambers where fear dressed itself as ceremony, in the empire that taught the world how elegantly brutality could be organized. Ancestral exists to keep walking back into those shadows, to keep listening for the voices buried beneath civilization's monuments, because history's darkest truths rarely disappear, they simply learn how to speak more softly.